Today I wanted to talk to you about my experience prior to coming to the Open University in 2022, last year. I was a senior editor at a journal called Nature Sustainability, part of the bigger cluster of nature research journals. And I was editor since before it launched in 2017 until 2021. So for 4 years, more or less. And I could see the transition from our struggles to launch the journal initially, and then when it became established. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my experience there, and especially focused on what tips I could give to people aiming to publish, not just in that journal, obviously, but like in generally in kind of high relevant or high impacts, if we want to use that word, interdisciplinary journals for a broad audience. And I have prepared a few slides so that you don't have to see my face all the time, which I hope I'll be able to share in a little bit. Presenting. Okay, yeah, you can see that. Perfect. Umut very kindly shared with us a few questions beforehand, and I've structured this little talk around these questions. The journal, so what's specific about nature sustainability? What happens with the first editorial decision, which we typically call, authors typically call a desk decision or desk rejections, something we don't like to see. And then what are the challenges for the editors during the peer review? And this is a really good question, because if you help the editors during this process in some ways, that can make their life much easier, and it can make the process much smoother. And then responding to feedback, which after, so during these 4 years at Nature Sustainability, I assessed about like over 1,200 manuscripts submitted to the journal. And if I'm not wrong, I handled like about 200 processes of peer review. So I saw lots of reviewer reports and responses to reviewer reports. And I guess the gist of it is that there is no, like, we could imagine that there is a standard way of approaching it, but like in real life, people are very diverse. So the way in which people, authors and reviewers would approach this process of writing the reviewer reports and the response was very diverse. And you could see personalities emerging through those processes. So the gist is that the idea is that to try avoid bringing your personality into that process and being as professional as possible in that writing, and at all times focus on the research itself, on the study, rather than starting with matters about what school of thought the reviewer is coming from, what is their ideology, and so on. So it's the real focus of the whole process should be the manuscript, the study, nothing else, not you, not the reviewers, nothing else. So having said that, the journal. This is, I'm going to talk about what's behind the scenes, and there is a particular feature about nature journals, which is that the editorial model is quite unique in the sense that the editors who make the decisions over publications are full-time editors. They don't have, they are not academics, as it happens with the rest of the journals, or most other journals. So they are specialists in doing this, like reading manuscripts, assessing them, deciding whether they have to send them for peer review, and then processing all the review process. This journal, and therefore what I'm going to talk about, is interdisciplinary. So it's focused on sustainability, mainly environmental sustainability, but it covers like lots of disciplines. And I was senior editor covering the social sciences, meaning that I would assess papers from political science, sociology, psychology, economics, and so on. So what I'm going to talk about applies to that kind of journal, so not a specialist one. The peer review process, I mean, most of you would be or should be familiar with this process, and it is the same in this kind of journals, in the nature journals. The authors send a draft article, the manuscript, then the editor, here highlighted in red, makes a triage, which is the desk decision. They assess using some criteria that I will talk about later, and they decide to send it for peer review. They find the reviewers, they receive the revised article, and then they decide, the editor decides whether to publish it directly, or whether to send it back to the authors and ask them to review, or whether to return to the authors, which is a synonym of rejecting the paper. Okay, so this should be quite clear for all of you. But sometimes I like emphasizing what happens before that, because what happens before submitting this manuscript, it has a huge influence on what is going to be the editorial decision at desk stage. Sometimes authors might not give as much importance as this part should have. So that's why I outline it here. So first one, selecting the appropriate outlet, which means that you're going to write a study that is suitable for that kind of journal. In here, of course, lots of considerations in terms of whether the message or the study that you're writing is appropriate for that journal, for that readership. And here you want to think about who reads that journal. That's at the end of the day the most important point in any publication. Who are going to be the readers? Other considerations that we take into account to select the journal. Then get to know the journal, which means that you want to make sure that you know what are the aims, what is the scope, but also what are the types of manuscripts they accept. They could be articles, they could be comments, they could be perspectives, and you want to know that very clearly. Get feedback, make sure that your writing is clear, not only for you who has been researching this for a long time, but also for others who are going to be the readers. You want to really make sure that this is understandable, also because the editor might not be a specialist in your field in this kind of journals, and the editor needs to really understand what you mean with our specialist jargon. Write a good cover letter. This depends on the journal. In nature journals, the cover letter is important. It's a good place to highlight the virtues of your study. And based on this process, we can also think about what happens in the first editorial decision. This is a sort of outline. This can give us an outline of which are the criteria that the editor uses in order to assess the paper and decide whether to move it forward in the review process. So first one, the type of content, the type of studies appropriate for the journal. It fits the scope, it's interesting. In this interdisciplinary journals, is the message, the finding, is it interesting beyond the specific discipline? So if I'm working in economics, is this study going to be useful, interesting for psychologists, for environmental scientists, for other people? Get to know the journal and understand the standards, the thresholds for moving it forward. And this is one of the biggest criteria in these journals, which is how original the paper is and what is the significance of the advance. So in comparison to the previous closest study, how much of a leap have we done in terms of knowledge advance? That's a key criteria. Then methods, they don't need to be innovative, you don't need to do anything new, but whatever you do, it has to be like well done. It has to follow the best standards within the discipline. And then, as I said, the manuscript has to be clear and also accessible for scholars who are not in your own discipline, meaning that any jargon, any specialist word needs a bit of definition. Here at the end of this slide, I say meet formatting guidelines, and this was something that as editors was quite, I would say, quite annoying. Occasionally, not very occasionally, it was more frequent than I would hope. Authors would submit papers that were much longer than required in the formatting guidelines. And even though the other formatting guidelines are not very important, the length is crucial. You can be a bit above, but it shouldn't be like double the size of the paper, the final paper. And there are many reasons for that, but one is that if we submit a paper that is too long, it shows that the authors are not able to be selective on what is the main message of that paper. And if as author I'm not selective and I just want to tell everything, then the paper is not going to be strong. It's not going to have a strong message to communicate to readers. That's one of the reasons. Also, in terms of length and the number of figures and tables, both of these are important. You don't want to submit like 16 figures when the limit is 6. Everything else can go to the supplementary information, and that's something that I encourage to do a lot. Challenges for editors during peer review, and I have highlighted here in red the points where you can help them. The most difficult one is finding reviewers who are suitable for the paper, so they do have the knowledge. They are independent, so in these journals, the reviewers should not have published with the authors or have any relation in terms of institution and so on, who are balanced in terms of schools of thoughts and so on, and are constructive, because the same critique can be done in a constructive way or in a sort of destructive way. And even though as authors we can interpret any destructive critique as something to improve, it's better to read something that reads more positively. For interdisciplinary journals, it's a challenge also finding reviewers who cover all the aspects of the paper. So imagine a paper that has work from psychology and from economics, so we want one of each, but who are also still open to other disciplines. So sometimes very like narrow focus economists might not approve of or might not accept statistical practices that are common in psychology. And we want reviewers who are kind of open to those, to that diversity. Assessing reviews, that's part of the challenge, which I'm not going to go in detail. We can talk about later. And then when the editor decides to revise and resubmit, that's because they see something, they see a possibility for the paper to go forward, meaning that none of the critiques are crucial. Like, for example, there is no fundamental critique to the method or to the sample, and that any revision is doable within the current study. I mean, the authors do not have to go back to the field and collect data again. That kind of that's the kind of picture we have when deciding revise and resubmit. Assessing authors' response to reviewers, here you can help them, the editor. As an author, you can help the editor by being very clear and very succinct in the responses, saying from the outset of each response how you have addressed it, and if you haven't, a clear acknowledgement of the comments, even though you don't agree with it, but explain how you kind of embrace it or how you consider it. And then professional correspondence, as I said, occasionally you had people who were not very professional, and that requires a lot of very delicate writing from the editors to make sure that the editor makes the point they want to make regarding the paper, but doesn't make the other person more like engaged or more angry. So I don't know how much longer I could talk, but then there are a few, just a few more things about,
3 to 5 minutes maybe.
Okay, thank you. So responding to feedback, that was kind of the last point I wanted to make, which is you might have feedback from two sources, the editors and the reviewers. Feedback from the editors, from my experience, is crucial. The editor is in your side because by deciding to move this paper forward, they see potential in the paper. So anything that they say is usually trying to improve the quality of the paper. So they will make recommendations mostly in terms of style, structure, presentation, and so on. And it is very, very, it makes the process very smooth if you accept or try to embrace recommendations about like shortening this part or making more clear this other part and so on. And then from reviewers, what to do. So I'll just show 1 or 2 slides about how to tackle the peer review response. And one issue that I see very commonly, and perhaps is the main challenge for us as researchers, because we are very attached to our work, is to not take the reviews emotionally. So we should read them. If it makes us angry or whatever, just leave it there for 1 day or 2. And then in the response, focus very strongly on the study. Remember that the paper is not yourself. The paper is a study, so it's a third subject. And in the writing, it is useful to focus on that. So instead of saying, I have done, it's useful to focus on the study does this, because you kind of detach a little bit from that. Sometimes reviewer reports are a bit harsh. What we can do with this is that, okay, if the review reports are harsh, there is always something that has raised this critique. And we want to try reading between lines what has raised that critique from the reviewer, and try to figure out how we can improve the paper to avoid that critique. Here I write it in the form of flipping the comments. Quite often, very critical reviews are because the reviewer hasn't understood, and that is not the fault of the reviewer, but we should think in terms of, okay, he hasn't understood, that means that I as an author, I need to be clearer, and I need to explain this much more explicitly. Peer feedback, that's useful, of course, getting more feedback during the review. And then something, the last point I wanted to make is something that you will find in the social sciences, but especially in economics, which is what happens when the reviewers are from another school of thought, and you notice that in the review reports. Here, this is an example of a sentence that is not real, but it's like a rephrase. So a paper has been reviewed, it has been rejected because the critique was very harsh, and the appeal, sometimes you can appeal to editor's decision, and sometimes they are successful. But in the appeal, we should not focus, or in the review response, we should not focus on the person himself or herself, but rather we should focus on the paper, the study. And typically with fights between schools of thought, a good strategy is to show that our approach is strong enough. We're not going to convince another person to change schools of thought, but we might be able to convince them, or at least the editor, that our argument is strong enough, that is well supported in good evidence or in other reviews and so on. So this is another big important tip that I would give. And that's it. I will leave it there, and I welcome your questions later in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Aiora, for a really, really enlightening presentation. That's been so helpful. May I pass on directly to Arabella?
Of course, with pleasure. And thanks, Aiora. That was great to have the presentation. So I've just kind of junketed half of what I was going to say. And I haven't got presentation, but I'll just kind of embellish a little, really. But that was a great guide. So for some years, I've been an associate editor at the Climate and Development Journal, which some of you might know, but its remit is really to publish around the human dimensions of climate change. It's not discipline specific either.
Switch your camera on.
Has it not come through?
No, I don't think so.
Ah.
I do see her. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see you. Sorry, I don't know. Maybe it was my line.
Ah, brilliant. No, that's fine. So it's not a discipline specific journal, but we don't necessarily take too many interdisciplinary papers. We have a suite of editors who cover different kind of thematics and issues. Some are economists, some like me are kind of non-economistic social scientists. I tend to take the papers that speak around migration and urban. So we have kind of themes, and we take work that is quite empirical. We also take kind of quite critical theoretical work. So it's been quite kind of fun and insightful being on such a kind of broad-ranging journal, but it may raise slightly different considerations, I think, to some of the kind of top-tier disciplinary specific journals, and we can talk about that. It's all about knowing your journals, I think, and what pieces you want to publish in different paces. An interesting feature of climate development we can also talk about is, I think we're all very committed to improving the diversity of content that we publish. And recognising that it's a global issue, but that there are severe knowledge gaps and imbalances in the kind of knowledge around climate and development that is represented even in bodies such as the IPCC. And there's been some really stellar and interesting studies about kind of, you know, the number of authors from different places on the IPCC and cited in the IPCC. And as you might expect, kind of underrepresentation, particularly of particular areas of the global south, and particular social groups. So as editors, and really the editors do influence the steer of the journal. So that's something to bear in mind when you're thinking about journals. We really want to take the time to mentor scripts that might not initially kind of reach kind of Anglophone, particularly standards of publishing, and be open to that. But that does take work both by the editors, and it does take having reviewers who are also kind of prepared to work with that constructively, and not just kind of simply apply standards, you know, all the time. It's not to say we lower the peer review bar, but that may go through more kind of revise and resubmit processes. So reviewers may be kind of engaged for longer in helping kind of coach manuscripts through, but we think that can be really important. So I'm an associate editor. Unlike Nature and Aiora's journal, our handling editors, our kind of editors-in-chief, are academics. They will do that desk reject process, and then the papers they want to see go through, they hand on to a team of associate editors. I'm actually going to move off being an associate editor to being on the editorial board, but then again, a wider group of people involved, kind of in the area of interest, who advise on the steer of the journal and also agree to kind of act as reviewers. So you can always see editorial boards, I think, on journal pages, and they will be involved somehow in some of that process, just not as intensively. In terms of journal process, it's very similar to the one that Aiora set out. 2 blind peer reviews on the first manuscript. We expect it to go back to authors, and then we try and send it back to the same reviewers. I have to say it's a massive challenge right now, not just finding initial reviewers, but then finding reviewers who are also prepared to re-review manuscripts. So a plea to people who take on reviewing, if you can stick with that as a process. I really don't like having to send revised manuscripts that have been revised on the basis of a particular viewpoint to new reviewers who then bring in new perspectives, and to me that always seems to undermine the process. But we are held by the kind of publishing house Taylor and Francis to certain standards. We have to go through the process of 2 reviews and 2 reviewers per kind of segment. So as an editor, my hands are a little tied. If a reviewer doesn't come back and re-review, I have to send it out again to a new reviewer, and that can kind of complexify the process. I think we have a pretty tight turnaround time for author kind of reviews. I think it's 3 weeks, which, particularly if you've got kind of to do some more structural work on a paper or more theoretical work on a paper, I think that's tight. And personally, as an editor, I would rather an author wrote to me and said, please, can we have more time to do this well, than the paper come in kind of with a rushed revision where we can't get it through. Because really, your editors want your papers. You know, they want good material. And I say the same to reviewers. If reviewers write to me and say, look, I'm really interested to review this paper, but can you give me an extra few weeks? I'd rather do that and get quality reviews to a certain point. So do approach editors politely, obviously, but do approach them, I think, through the process. I think something to add to what Aiora said is a major challenge in kind of for papers, for accepting papers. One of the major kind of common challenges is making sure that papers really connect those findings to wider debates. That's got to be really clear. So it may be brilliant that you have some data about X, but like Aiora said, we want to know how that advances knowledge. We want to know what's the background here. You know, does this tell me more about crop production in Iraq? And then does this even tell me more about the relationship between climate and agriculture, or agricultural policy and climate? So, and that is the most common reason why my colleagues who do that very initial desk reject process reject papers, because they can't see clearly kind of what the paper is adding to a particular debate or a particular field. So making that very clear is really important. Like Aiora, I was going to say, know your journal, and there's a number of ways, and having been an author as well, I would say different pieces of work also speak to different things. So it's not necessarily a uniform process. Again, you might have different styles and types of work, from a kind of standard research paper to an opinion piece. And some journals are doing more and more interesting formats, actually. An urban studies journal I was looking at recently is kind of publishing more and more visual work with commentary, you know, and different editorial kind of groups are trying to be innovative, I think, in how we publish. So do look around. There are different ways to publish different things. Think about who the journal is reaching, and the top tier disciplinary journals may be great for some things, but they may not actually reach some of the audience you want to for a particular piece of work. So it is a bit horses for courses, and I would kind of, you know, not assume that all journals head towards the same place, and there may be a spectrum. I got the climate and development webpage links very nicely to a Taylor and Francis website that I just want to share with you all, that is about journal metrics. They're a bit of a nightmare as far as I'm concerned. They are confusing. I'm going to put it in the chat, so if people want to take it away, because it's very good on balance, on saying metrics are useful for some things but not for others. So if you want to understand a particular journal or even a particular paper, here are the strengths and limitations of what metrics alone will tell you. And metrics are not everything by any kind of stretch of the imagination, but this is really quite useful. But obviously you may have other considerations. If you really want to publish something quickly, does the journal have a lot of volumes and a lot of editors, or does it publish much less? And there's nothing wrong with journals that publish less. They may just receive less material for their particular topic area, or, you know, choose to take on less, but, you know, it doesn't reflect on the quality of the journal. But that may be something you want to look at, depending on whether you're happy to kind of sit with that revise and resubmit process for quite a while, or whether you really just want to get something out there. Again, it depends kind of what your research and your paper dictates. Feedback, and then a word on reviewers. Feedback. So it's not just a question of returning your revised paper. I'd say a really good way to make clear what you've done is to attach a table. So set the reviewer's comments broken down across the table in one column, and then in the other column, just say how you've answered them. That is really critical for editors, because we have so many papers to look through all the manuscripts very carefully. Really is very hard. But when authors do that for me, and there's a page reference and I can see they've made the track changes in the paper, it's absolutely brilliant, and it makes it much clearer. So do that. Do ask for more time if you need, and editors are usually sympathetic, and I've been on the receiving end of that as well. But do be robust. I mean, I think if you think that a reviewer comment is misplaced or misunderstands your paper, there are ways of saying, you know, we have thought about this comment, and while it's illuminating in this way, actually, this isn't what we were trying to do. Or I've recently, actually, in a response to reviewers, had to say, these are all great comments, but the word limit is 8,000 words, and I cannot possibly include all of this material. So again, in the review process, we've been selective, and we'll leave it to the editor to judge kind of whether, you know, that's appropriate or not. So, but don't be afraid to be polite and robust. You may not be able to incorporate everything, especially when reviewers come from different perspectives. Yeah, and just, yeah, a plea for reviewing to see it through, really, and use appropriate language. And remember, you know, there are some guidelines beginning to float around about how it might be nicer to frame the language of reviews sometimes, you know, to make suggestions and to ask people politely with a please if they wouldn't mind doing this. I know people are reviewing in haste. But as Aiora says, it is also an emotional process sometimes, and especially where we're trying to encourage people to publish for the first time, or they're at an early stage in their publishing career. The reviewers won't know that, but I would treat in every manuscript there is a huge amount of work. So yeah, no, that's it from me, but I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Arabella. That was really interesting as well. And it's really good to hear different perspectives, I think. Let me pass on to Les.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. Yes, I will focus on one journal, Science as Culture, because I was a co-founder back in 1987, and since then I've been either the editor or co-editor. As you might guess from the title, it lies at the intersection of cultural studies and science and technology studies, also known as the social studies of science and technology and medicine. We publish mainly research papers with a maximum of 10,000 words, emphasizing theory. Around 2010, we realized that our letters to authors had been repeating similar requests across the papers, so we codified those requests as a general editorial guidance. And it starts with a mission statement saying, our culture is a scientific one, defining what is natural and what is rational. Its values can be seen in what are sought out as facts and made as artifacts, what are designed as processes and products, what are forged as weapons and filmed as wonders. And it goes on in that vein. Then it goes on to requirements for the structure, which I'll briefly describe. It must start with a publicly important issue, pose a research question about that issue, and then explain one or more theoretical concepts from either cultural studies or STS as a basis for answering the question through the paper. And then the conclusion must summarize the argument. This structure may sound obvious, but most submissions don't exactly follow that structure. And our submission system has a question: have you ensure that your paper complies with the guidance? And of course, they all tick yes, even if they haven't done so. And we have a checklist, a template with points corresponding to that guidance for the use by associate editors, reviewers, and guest editors of special issues so that they can ensure compliance or find anomalies. As the procedure, that's pretty similar to most journals, I think, that my co-editor screens out papers that may be unsuitable, that is, for a desk reject, and then assigns the rest of the papers to an associate editor, who may in turn recommend a desk reject. And the survivors, about half the papers that were submitted, go to external reviewers. What are reasons for a desk reject? Well, these correspond closely to the guidance document. That is, the paper diverges from the guidelines. It does not substantially use relevant theory, even if theoretical concepts are cited, perhaps in a gestural way or playing an ornamental role, but not substantially used. A paper may proliferate concepts without clearly using any of them to illuminate the case study. And in some cases, the paper lacks a clear argument. It just jumps around, and that a test is the conclusion, whether that summarizes the overall argument. Now, I'll mention some challenges, as we were asked to do so, in finding reviewers. Of course, probably like most journals, we search for reviewers either from our internal database or from other sources who have published on a topic similar to the specific paper. But here's the problem, that they may not be familiar with the theoretical concept which the author used for that paper. And we see those theoretical concepts as just as important or even more important for evaluating the paper. So we just have to hope that the reviewers will engage with those concepts. When we make our own judgment, we do consider the reviewer's advice and cite key points from those reviews in our letter, but we give greater weight to our own judgment, which has been generally more stringent than the external reviewers, perhaps because we apply a broader range of criteria for judging strengths and weaknesses. Challenges in editorial judgments. I'll mention two kinds of challenges. One is, at the first stage, whether a weak paper should be rejected outright, or whether it has enough promise to warrant a reject and resubmit, meaning that it may need several redrafts before it's even clear whether it's getting closer to acceptance. So that's a big decision, because we know it would take a lot of work by reviewers and us to go through all those stages. So we are selective in that regard, and it needs a drastic rewrite for internal coherence, linking a research question, empirical material, and theory. Another kind of challenge is where a paper either was needing major revision or has been improved to the stage where it needs major revision, but it just stays at that status even after a couple redrafts, because it does not really engage with our editorial requests. So then the question arises whether simply to reject it or to give another chance. In any case, we tried to make positive suggestions for improvement, and often the author does take up at least one or more of those suggestions. There are some general weaknesses of papers which may not be initially fatal, that is, leading to a desk reject, but do become a problem.
Then would be pretty much anything happening at night. So it had to be in a place easily accessible from all sides of town, and that would provide plausible deniability if members of the respective.
Okay, I'll continue. Yes, so I mentioned some of these commonplace weaknesses, just in no particular order, that the author introduces their own new concept in order to promote their concept, fair enough, but without demonstrating why it's necessary, without demonstrating the limitations of other relevant concepts, or showing how their concept builds on them. So there are papers which you might call a claim to fame for a new concept. And if it's totally new without demonstrating the relevance to other concepts, then it doesn't go well generally in our journal. Another weakness is proliferating more concepts than could be feasibly used in a journal paper, rather than being pragmatically selective. Another weakness is it makes a straw man argument about weaknesses of a particular theoretical concept or area without even quoting relevant passages from such literature to demonstrate that these really are the ideas in that literature and therefore might warrant the criticism. Some papers claim that there's a gap in the literature without adequately checking that it really is a gap, or more subtly, without explaining why the gap matters for the theoretical concept or for the area. I mean, without that kind of explanation, there could be hundreds of gaps, but why do they matter? In some cases, the paper obscures the role of human agency, implying, I say implying, that humans become the agents of some impersonal force, or the agents of a theoretical concept, almost fulfilling a teleological role of that concept. So we emphasize the concepts, their use should emphasize how people's actions pursue particular aims and means to achieve their aims, and the concepts should try to explain that process. Now, as regards dealing with all the editorial comments, often that would be impossible because there are so many, at least not within the length limit that we set. So the author should prioritize what's most important and justify that priority in the cover letter. Justify why particular concepts or approaches would be the most helpful for their research question, while others would be less helpful. So we are very open to suggestion or persuasion about what should be the priorities for revision. So I think I stopped there.